it'll just be a minute, so I'll hand it over. We are under some time constraints, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Murad Okandan. I'm one of the organizers for the workshop. And we're very delighted to have all of you here. And our opening remarks are going to be by Julie Phillips, who's our Chief Technology Officer for Sandia National Labs. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thanks, Marat. It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome you all to Albuquerque and to Sandia, or near Sandia, about 10 miles away. My role this morning, as I understand it, is to deliver a welcome and to give you a little bit of background about Sandia and why it is that we are so interested in brain-inspired computation. As many of you know, Sandia came into existence as its own separate entity in 1949. Prior to that time, the effort that became Sandia was incorporated in Los Alamos National Laboratory as the Engineering Division, or the Z Division. And in 1949, President Harry Truman wrote a letter to AT&T and to Bell Laboratories, basically asking AT&T to, quote, render an exceptional service in the national interest. And that essentially has become Sandia's motto ever since that time. AT&T operated Sandia for many years until 1993. Since that time, Sandia has been operated by first Martin Marietta and then Lockheed Martin for the U.S. government. So exceptional service in the national interest is our motto, and it pretty much determines everything that we do. Of course, at the beginning, that service was around the nuclear weapons program, and our responsibility was the engineering around what is called the physics package, the uranium, plutonium, or whatever. And so the radars, firing sets, that sort of thing. Over time, that mission has broadened to include a variety of things in the national security arena, and we are currently organized around 3 business areas. The first and largest of those is the nuclear weapons program. That is, at the moment, something like 50% of the laboratory. The other 50% is divided into 3 pieces. One of those is in the area of energy, climate, and infrastructure security. So this deals with our energy programs, our climate efforts, as well as efforts around assuring the infrastructure of our nation. Another business area is international homeland and nuclear security. This is where much of our non-proliferation effort resides, as well as the work that we do for the Department of Homeland Security, among other things. And then finally, we have the Defense Systems and Assessments business area, which includes most of our work for the Department of Defense and for the intelligence agency. So there are very common themes that run across all of these. Of course, the broad one is the theme of national security, the theme of engineering, and so forth. And as time has gone on, issues around the interface between engineered systems and human beings has become increasingly important. And of course, another area that's very important is computation. So themes that you will be talking about during this workshop have become increasingly important as the laboratory has continued to mature. Of course, underlying all of those business areas is a very strong research organization or research effort that spans most of the organizations at the laboratory. And the mission of that research is really 2-pronged. First is to enable mission delivery, both today as well as indefinitely into the future. And second, to advance the frontiers of science and engineering. And any time we look at a research endeavor that we might undertake, we ask ourselves the question, why should we do it at Sandia? And in particular, will this research area enhance our ability to meet our mission needs? And second, do we have the capability or do we have the potential of developing the capability to advance the frontiers of science and engineering? In other words, to be leaders in whatever field it is that we're looking at. And so in the same way we've asked that question about all of the other research areas that we are actively engaged in, we ask that around brain-inspired computing. And that's one of the reasons that we are having the workshop. We have a series of what we call research foundations that define a high percentage of the research that we do at the laboratories, not all by any means. And these research foundations, for the most part, derive from our very deep roots in the nuclear weapons program and have been part of the laboratories for many decades. 6 of the 7 that are shown on this view graph, in fact, do go back for many decades. These include computing and information sciences, radiation effects and high energy density science, materials science, engineering sciences, which is both the very large scale applications codes for modeling and the various environments and structures that we deal with, not only in the weapons program, but in the other programs we undertake. Geosciences, nanodevices, and microsystems. Those 6 derive from the weapons program, still have very strong roots in the weapons program, but have broadened over the years to also provide a strong foundational base for the other mission areas that we serve. And finally, the 7th research foundation is the Bioscience Research Foundation. This one actually goes back for, at this point, probably 12 to 15 years, and really rose to prominence, particularly after 9/11, as we started thinking about the new kinds of threats that the nation is facing in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War and all of the other global developments that we all are very acutely aware of. Cognitive science research is not a research foundation. However, it has grown very significantly over the last decade or so, growing to a few tens of millions of dollars spread across several of our business areas. And it spans all the way from sort of the micro level, looking at the very cellular-based sorts of processes that are important in cognition, all the way up to social, where one hopes to be able to predict the behavior of seemingly unpredictable individuals and that sort of thing. And has really inserted itself into the fabric of our research community here at the laboratory. At the micro level, of course, in the brain-inspired computing, we're very interested in it because we do have those research foundations of computational and information sciences, as well as nanodevices and microsystems. And now, just thinking a little bit about where Sandia is going in the future, we as a laboratory are in the process of identifying a series of mission challenges and research challenges. Mission challenges are those things that are looming on, we believe are looming on the horizon or already known to us in our national security mission space, for which Sandia is particularly well positioned or must position itself to be able to respond in the future. Research challenges are those scientific and engineering challenges that underlie the mission challenges that we have to address in order to be successful in meeting the mission challenges. And walking you through just a few of the ones that we are talking about at this point, when we take 2 of our research foundations, nanodevices and microsystems, and the Computer and Information Sciences Research Foundation, and we look at the interface or the overlap between the 2, we come to the conclusion that one of the big research challenges facing us and facing actually the nation and the world is the issue of beyond Moore's law. And what happens as CMOS technology, which has been the basis for our high-performance computing, actually comes to an end. And we have to look at other kinds of logic devices. Not only that, but we have to take those logic devices and somehow knit them together into a computational machine. Once we have that machine, we need to be able to program it, and then we have to run the applications we care about on it. So this is a very multifaceted problem that requires not only the ability to explore and understand the various kinds of devices that will go into the next generation computer, but also what we do, how we put those devices together to make a computer and actually use it to do useful computation. So I think you'll agree that's truly a research challenge of the highest order, and we believe that the interplay that we have between computer and information sciences and nanodevices and microsystems puts us in a particularly strong position to make some very important contributions in this critical area. If we now add in cognitive science and technology, we come up with another very significant research challenge facing the U.S. and the world, and that is the problem of big data, or perhaps it would be better to say data science. How you take the huge amounts of data that are streaming in from various sources, be they satellites or communication systems or whatever they are, and pull those nuggets out of it. How you know which data are important and which data you can throw away. Or in some cases you have incomplete data, and how you can draw conclusions from that incomplete data and know to what extent you can trust it. So another research challenge that is going to benefit from the intersection of computing and information sciences, an established area, as well as cognitive science and technology, an area in which we are investing, and the reason why you all are here. And then finally, if we look at the nexus of all three of these areas, we see neuro-inspired computing, which brings together the approaches to computation that transcend our traditional approaches, as well as potential new approaches to dealing with the data science and the huge data or the sparse data kinds of problems. And so this fits very squarely at the nexus of several areas in which the laboratory is investing. And when we think about why we should go forward in this area, we do ask the question, why Sandia? Clearly, we need to have national security impact because we are a national security laboratory. We need to build from an existing capability base, which in this case we clearly are, as well as a capability base that we have grown rather strongly over the last decade or so. And not only that, but we believe that Neuro-Inspired Computing has the potential not only to enable various parts of our mission, but also very clearly to advance the frontiers of science and engineering. So I regret that I won't be able to be with you the rest of the day, but I do look forward to hearing the results of the conversation and to coming away with a lot more insight into ways in which Sandia in particular can contribute to this very significant problem. So thanks very much. I hope you have a wonderful conference.
Our next speaker is Mike Bali, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Sandia.
Thank you, Murat. Actually, I'm not the Chief Technology Officer. That was you just heard from. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Sandia. Perhaps before I get to the actual talk, I'd like to make some introductory comments. When Murat first came and mentioned to me that he was planning to host a conference like this, I must admit I got quite excited about it. And Murat through conversation, actually asked me that perhaps there was some lessons learned from the computing programs sponsored for the nuclear weapons program that might have some bearing on this question. Neuro-Inspired Computing, and my tag on it is why now. The more I thought about it, the more it became really quite obvious that there's a rich history to computing. If you got into the details of it, it could very easily grow to a book-length conversation. So what I really strived to do was to pick some themes out of the history, or at least what I knew of the history, that might actually be pertinent and germane to the set of questions that you'll be examining this week. With that in mind, the three rather high-level themes that I came up with that I think actually drove the great success that at least high-performance computing has experienced over the last 50 years were really quite simple. The problem: what is driving the need for this technology? In the case of nuclear weapons, I think the case is well made that the problem is substantial, it's of national importance, and it was a point that people could rally around for a long period of time. The second point is that the technology really does need to exist, but more importantly, it needs to be understood at a very deep, fundamental level. Digital computing, the whole microelectronics activity, I think can make the claim that it provides a really strong underpinning for the current high-performance computing technologies. And a lot of those technologies existed at the Nuclear Weapons Laboratory and really did help move the technology forward at critical times, addressing those problems that I mentioned before. And then finally, a third point, and one that is often, I think, forgotten, is that you really do need a programmatic structure around the technology and the problem that's going to provide the resources that really do free the people that are doing the innovation from the need to constantly innovate to get money. And the DOE, and before that the AAC, provided that programmatic structure, and they really did become stewards of high-performance computing and made sure that the resources were there along the path to make sure that it was a successful endeavor. So I think those three points are probably the theme that accounts for the really tremendous impact that high-performance computing has had on modern society. As is often the case when you're starting to think about a problem, you have opportunities to read about it in different forums. I just finished reading the book, The Ideal Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Invention by John Gertner. And it struck me that as I read that book, and perhaps it was the mindset I went into reading that book, but I heard the same message coming out of that book. Hard but important problems, innovation, that's what inspires people to really achieve great things. Scientific understanding drives progress. And the institution that provides resources that allow engineers and researchers to focus on the problem is one of the key parts of that equation. So I took that kind of as at least some indication that perhaps those three principles did have some universal properties to them, and maybe something worth thinking about this week as you decide how to make progress on neuro-inspired computing. Once again, the problem, the technology, and the program around it. Another point, and I didn't really quite realize it and hadn't thought about it, but I think it's very interesting, is that the success of Bell Labs actually was the seeds of their demise. Something we can think about, maybe even talk about at lunch. I'm not going to really belabor that today, but I think it was an interesting point to be made. So with that as an introduction, I think I'd like to move on into the talk. There's a couple of talks that are going to follow this. Rob Leland's going to probably elaborate on some of these points and maybe abstract them some. And then after that, Marat will start focusing in on the technology. So with that in mind, and the charge that Marat gave me, I do want to start with the history of high-performance computing. There is no real starting point that I think you can point to. Some people go back to Babbage or even Leibniz in terms of the initial thoughts about how you do computing. But I think certainly around the 1940s, mid-1940s, there was a lot of activities about digital computing and how it might actually impact a number of scientific problems that were really important at the time. There's certainly the national defense problems. Nuclear weapons was certainly one of the, at the forefront of some of those, but also weather prediction, climate modeling, and the other one were the intelligence problems of analyzing data and doing encryption type problems. But the two that seemed to carry the day were certainly nuclear weapons and weather prediction. This is a timeline, at least from a nuclear weapons perspective, of some of the main achievements along the path. The problem, at least as it was initially proposed, was how do you build nuclear weapons that are not predictable but understandable? And it amounted back then to taking test data, and there was a lot of test data at the time because there was a lot of tests going on, and actually processing that data and seeing how it really does impact future designs. So the imperative at the time was analyzing test data. With the evolution of the political spectrum around the 1980s, early 1990s, testing disappeared. And so the problem, the weapons didn't go away, the problems remained, and so the whole methodology shifted to one of prediction. So without being able to test, how are you going to predict and guarantee that the nuclear weapons stockpile is still robust and maintainable into the future? And that became a new set of problems that actually began to redrive and reinvigorate computing back in the late 1990s. There was government programs established around these ideas called ASCII, or later ASC, Advanced Simulation and Computing Programs. And so along the timeline, you can see the technology evolving. The IBM 704, IBM was a big player from the very beginning in high-performance computing, but then CDC, Cray, and eventually there was a whole new set of partners and industry partners that started focusing in on parallelism. The technology model that was driving this, and Julie already talked about it, was Moore's Law, the doubling of capability about every 18 months. But when we got to the late 1990s, it just wasn't enough anymore. And the whole idea and the intellectual breakthrough at that time was parallelism. And so you saw architectures like N-Cube, the Paragon, later ASCII Red, and Red Storm. The timeline got awfully busy. It became somewhat of a Sandia perspective on this, but certainly each of the other weapons laboratories could draw this timeline, and they would put similar breakthrough capabilities on it, whether it was the Blue Gene architecture out at Livermore, or the breakthroughs that happened up at Los Alamos. So this is certainly not a Sandia story, but it did provide the details that I could quickly access, at least from my memory. So the problem, it was the nuclear weapons problem, began with testing, trying to understand the performance based on the data you're taking out of the field, making corrections based on that understanding, and then the paradigm shift where no testing regimen took hold, and prediction based on modeling and simulation really became the imperative. The technology, so those are the problems. The technology, once again, was digital computing, microelectronics. Parallelism became very important about the late 1990s. And then the whole methodology of how you're going to use these resources changed and actually started affecting the architectures and the path that HPC was evolving on. And I tried to depict it in the cartoon on the right, but you had now data that was coming out of experiments. You had modeling, the code predictions, and then also what reality was saying about the whole situation. And then methodology was, in a very understandable, predictable, and repeatable way, is putting all that data together to make predictions about reality based on what you're seeing coming out of models. And the whole methodology of V&V, verification, validation, and then finally margin uncertainty, quantifying margin uncertainties evolved from this. So we see here in this timeline the three principles. The problem, it continued to evolve, but it always had that aspect of being of national importance. The technology that people understood at a very fundamental level and were able to make really dramatic changes at key points in the history where no longer vector processing was going to work. We had to migrate to parallelism, and all the sundry things around it, operating systems, storage and everything, migrated with it. And then finally, the program. The nuclear weapons program has had governmental support, a very rich history of stewardship that has driven this history for 50 years now, 60 years I guess it is at current. So with that long history, I think we are reaching another paradigm shift. Julie already talked about it. I think you're going to hear more about this today. But the technology is really facing some physical limitations, both in the need for power. Some of these machines currently on the drawing board would take 30 megawatts of power to operate them. And those are just prohibitive in terms of cost and on the environment and so forth. And so that is one thing that's driving this switch. Memory speeds, the data sets are getting so large and the memory so large in response to it that it's not only driving the power limitations, but actually the speed of the calculations getting to that data. Second bullet is probably more detail on that. I think Julie also talked about that the data has become large, noisy, incomplete, and it's being driven not only by high-performance computing, but the evolution of the internet. And so the nature of modeling data sets are changing, and how are we going to adapt to those changes that are upon us. And then the other thing that I note really did change, and we're seeing the effects at Sandia, is the problem set is beginning to change also. Modeling simulations is very much about solving PDEs, trying to make predictions based on that mathematical construct. But after 9/11, the set of problems really did shift to one of analyzing data just to look for the needles in the haystack. And the paradigm of how you approach those are much different. The impacts on the architectures are really only beginning to be explored and plumbed, but yet they're certainly indicating that there's changes that are at hand. So I think in this case, other people might draw different conclusions because there are a lot of forks in this path right now, but certainly one of them is neuro-inspired computing. When I say that, I kind of think very naively that we have a device that's very capable. Everyone has one. We walk around with them all the time. What is that telling us about what path we ought to follow into the future? And I think the case can be made, and I think this week is about understanding that case, is that neuro-inspired is the answer to a lot of these questions. The two cartoons there, certainly the architecture on the left is the von Neumann architecture that came out of the early studies on on computing, and the cartoon on the right is certainly, I guess, the human brain. I'm not sure. I'm not a biologist. It might be a squirrel's brain. But anyway, the case I'm trying to make here, at least at a very high level, is the change is upon us. We're looking for potential solutions in the future. Here is one that's staring us in the face, and we really ought to plumb the depths of it. I can't resist telling a little bit of the history. There's a book out now called Turing's Cathedral that actually depicts on a much more elegant way than I did the history of high-performance computing. It's by George Dyson, son of Freeman Dyson. I think most of you probably heard of Freeman, but George is equally interesting. And he tells the story of the digital universe, and it's pretty much the history I just told you, but in the richness of the people that were part of it and the institutions that participated in it, and the problem sets, nuclear weapons and weather prediction that actually drove it. I can't resist telling a story about von Neumann. He came out of Hungary. He was certainly a child prodigy, and at the age of 16, he was starting to look around Europe for a university that he would attend the following year. And his travels brought him to Göttingen. And when Hilbert heard that von Neumann was coming, because his reputation was of such a magnitude, that he was quite excited that von Neumann might actually come to that university. Von Neumann made the request that he wanted to meet Landau, who was a number theorist and probably the best in Europe at the time, probably the best in the world. And so Hilbert was glad to make sure that that contact was made. So von Neumann showed up, and he was dutifully escorted into Landau's office. The door closed. About 3 hours later, Landau came out. Von Neumann came out very energetic, very, very high-spirited person. And Landau, though, looked a bit depressed, and Hilbert went up to him after the fact and asked him what happened. He said, well, von Neumann was certainly a joy to talk to. And I asked him if he was familiar with my work. And Landau at that time had probably a opus of work that filled the shelf on anybody's bookcase. And Landau said that von Neumann responded that when he heard he was going to meet Landau, he read the books the previous month. So Landau decided that maybe I'll quiz him on them, and he had certainly read it and mastered it. So I think von Neumann was of that intellectual caliber that the world very seldom sees. He certainly picked this up as a problem. He was surrounded by a celebrity of other very capable people touring from England, focused on the cryptography problem. And the person at the bottom, there isn't a lot of pictures left of the person, but his name was Baricelli. And he was really focused on the relationship of computing to biology, evolution, and the human brain. And I think it's somewhat interesting that this history is now kind of circled back to where the concepts that Baricelli was really kind of pushing, and they certainly weren't forgotten. Genetic algorithms, a lot of different technology, artificial intelligence probably really did grow out of his work, but the prominence of it and the potential for that line of computing to actually be maybe the answer to some of these questions, I think is quite remarkable. So I felt obliged to kind of point it out. I'd recommend the book. It's really quite a delightful read. So some questions that I'll leave you with that certainly occurred to me as I was preparing this talk. The brain does a lot of pattern matching. Is that the right paradigm for the type of problems we'll be talking about in the future? Does the brain provide the right, probably in this case, the correct model? How do you program these problems? How do you represent the data sets and then process them? Are all obvious questions. Is the technology really to the point where we can start building some of these things? I know there's a lot of technology talks this week. I'll be interested in the answer to this, and hopefully others will be too. I think there's some issues that are right on the boundaries of this problem, and maybe you may be interested in talking about some of them and seeing where they might lead. There's certainly a lot of ethical problems, issues I should say. I don't know that they're necessarily problems, but they're things that we ought to be considering. And certainly cultural issues in terms of when the machines take on characteristics of human thinking, what's going to be the impact to all of us currently and into the future. And then one last thing, and we talked a little bit about it with the internet. With foresight, can we avoid the pitfalls that plague modern computers and networks? What I had in mind are viruses, worms, hacking, computer security. But I think probably right under the surface are a whole host of other problems that if we spent some time thinking about, we might actually get a leg up as we embark on this journey. So there's some thoughts here that I hope are meaningful or might actually cause you to think about the problem a little bit differently. I'm kind of excited about it. I'm really interested to hear what people have to say this week. And with that, I welcome you to the conference, and thanks for your attention.
Am I on the mic?
That's just for the
Oh, okay. Very good. Matt would be here introducing me as the Director of Computing Research at Sandia. But right now he's just setting up things for me. Is that going to work? Yeah. So I thought I would start off with a little bit of an introduction about the motivating circumstance. My title here is Computing, Neurons, and National Security. And the thing that's really driving us to think more intently about this is the erosion of Moore's law. In the popular psyche, Moore's law is computing power doubles every 18 months or 2 years. But really what Moore said was more nuanced than that. He said that when you shrink an integrated circuit feature by a certain ratio, you increase the speed with which you can operate that circuit by the same ratio, by the inverse of the ratio. And of course you get more on the chip in proportion to the square of that ratio. And you can do that all for constant power density. So it's really kind of a magical triple constraint. And you can see down there in the lower left corner that he had about a half a dozen data points. So it was a bold prediction in 1965. But it held true for about 3 or 4 decades without any issue. Starting in about the early 2000s, though, one of those constraints started to roll off. You notice that your laptop has about the same frequency of operation as it did 10 years ago. And in fact, now, in the current era, we're starting to lose that power density constraint. And eventually, probably within about a decade, the density of the circuits will no longer be sustainable. So that linear extrapolation there that would represent continued exponential improvement on the log scale will be lost. So we're really thinking now about what we're going to do to build high-end computers in 10 years, and it's not going to be based on the traditional CMOS roadmap. So some reflections on that, and this relates directly to what Mike was talking about. Moore's law really is sort of the commoditization of that Turing-von Neumann vision. That's what made it highly economical. Once the ideas were in place, it was the creation of the production technology that accounted for the exponential improvement and really drove the digital revolution that we all have experienced. And as Mike said, the national security was really the big early driver for that. Hydrogen bomb simulations, cryptography, ballistics tables for the conventional munitions. And the national security also depended intimately on this computing capability. This was a vital edge in that era. So what happens when this peters out over a decade? So Sandia is very preoccupied with national security, and we're seeking a new approach to computing that embraces those concerns and instaurs some sort of exponential improvement path, so implies some further commoditization of some new technology. And I'm going to, just a newsflash here, I'm going to argue that that's Neuro-Inspired Computing. And it may not follow the Turing or von Neumann model. In fact, it probably won't. Let me just step back for a moment and provide a little context on national security landscape. This is some work that was done 12 years ago or so at the laboratory as part of our Advanced Concepts Group, which was an internal think tank where we were mapping things out. And it's simplified, of course, but it's an interesting rolling up of some issues. So if you think about 2 axes, global versus local on the vertical axis and destructive versus constructive on the horizontal axis, you come up with 4 quadrants that characterize most of the national security issues that we deal with today. So, of course, on the upper left, you've got war, conventional conflict, nuclear deterrence would fit there, containment philosophy, etc. We call that the black color. In the lower left quadrant, you've got security, homeland security, terrorism, crime, for example. The upper right is issues around sustainability of the environment, resource conflicts, development, eco-migration, climate change. And in the lower right, you've got a set of issues around human need, healthcare, prosperity, education, etc. So this is the basic framework that we use to think about national security, at least that I do. The next theme I want to suggest is that of technology convergence. If you take a look at the time frame for major innovations in human society, there's an interesting effect that you can notice. I've used a generation index here. This actually is adapted from an NSF workshop about a decade ago, where, say, 10,000 human generations ago, we discovered how to use tools. 500 generations drawing in caves, etc., all the way down. And what you notice is that the cycle time is decreasing markedly. And also the number of themes, the sort of sense of synergy is increasing as you go down this path. And so if you just sort of follow that sequence, we're sort of due for another major revolution, some sort of synergistic combination of new technologies. That's the convergence that we're speaking of here. And what is that? Well, I want to suggest one answer, and it's the synthesis of 4 major technology themes: biotechnology, information technology, nanotechnology, and cognitive technology. I've called it cogno here, so it ends in an O like everything else. Okay. And with this simple metaphor, you can start to think about possible technological developments, and at least it's been helpful to me to stimulate my thinking about what are the possibilities. So for example, you can fill in the edges of this little diagram. Between bio and info, there's cellular signaling, which we're starting to understand now as a result of mapping the DNA and instrumenting things at the cellular level. There's cellular sensors on the nano-info axis there, and you can see that the ones going up to the cognitive apex there are all neuro-related. Conventional neural networks interfacing to neurons, or neural hardware, for example, the Cognimem folks in the back here. Well, of course, those represent the synthesis of 2 technologies, those edges do. And then you can start to look at the planes that represent the synthesis of 3 technological themes. So there are 4 faces here, each of them representing or touching 3 of the themes. And an example would be creating a neural network out of actual live neurons. That would be a combination of cognitive, bio, and information technologies. And you can see a number of other examples here. Now these are, this work was done at the lab circa 2000, and I decided not to update these examples because it was interesting to me that even back then there was substantive work going on at very respected institutions in each of these areas. And I thought it might be interesting context to consider how far things have come in the previous decade. You can go one step further and look at the synthesis of 4 technologies, those things that are in the volume now of that tetrahedron. And it gets a little hard to tell visually, but you could consider that to be a set of axes, and if you're close to one apex, you're heavily weighted in that technology and less so in the others. So some examples here would be a brain-machine interface in the lower left, some sort of artificial immune system that would be regulated, probably neurally, a cognitive prosthetic, something that would help you in your daily task. I could use that. Or ultimately, probably the holy grail there would be synthetic intelligence of some form, something that would master natural language and human sort of reasoning in a very facile way. So I'd like to suggest that this is a very kind of notional roadmap. It's a lens through which to view the topic. And what's particularly interesting is, if you think about, to me anyway, is if you think about those national security challenges that Mike talked about and that I mentioned earlier and that Julie referred to, historically we have addressed those in the physical domain. Most of our competence is in physical science, engineering, certainly at the laboratory, and that's our typical approach to the national security problems that we face. And it's vitally important, of course. But if you go back to these national security problems, it turns out that most of them have intrinsically in them a cognitive aspect. The behavior of the decision-making of an individual or the behavior of a group is really central to the dynamic of the problem. And so it's our belief, or my belief anyway, that operating solely in the physical realm to address those problems is not going to be sufficient. Now, of course, many other institutions and agencies in the government think about cognitive aspects of these problems, but typically not from a technological point of view. And so our aspiration here is to deepen our understanding of cognitive science in a way that will help us to address those national security problems also in the behavioral realm, or cognitive realm. So that was the basic message I want to leave you with, and I'd be interested if, Marat, do we have time for any interaction with the audience? Okay. So, yeah, so we've got a few minutes for that. Jim.
So, Rob, actually, Phil Rubin, Mike Rothman, and I just finished a white paper which will be published later this year, and we lifted, of course, this figure of yours, the original form, but I think it's extraordinarily important getting to the center of where these various threads of U.S. government enterprises and brain science are moving forward. And really, if you look at the history of U.S. investments in brain sciences over the last 20 years, and you want to make sense of them as opposed to seeing them as a mismatch, a mishmash, this is definitely the way to go in terms of thinking about it. So I salute you.
Thank you. Thanks for the feedback. I'm indebted to my colleagues. I was going to show acknowledgments here. The Moore's Law slide is from Eric de Benedictis, and the national security landscape from Jerry Jonas, and that I used to call it the cognohedron, that figure that we talked about. That depended on a lot of dialogue with my colleagues back there in the 2000 period. So, did I succeed in provoking anybody to a question? Okay, very well. Well, we can get a little ahead of schedule then. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? No. Can everybody hear me now? Great. So, if I'm successful today, I'm going to provoke you to some extent with the notion that we better do something in the area of the intersection of computing and neuroscience fairly rapidly, or our country is going to be in trouble. And I'm going to start with a notion that comes from a very close colleague of mine at George Mason University, Tyler Cowen, who published this book, which became a New York Times bestseller last year. It's called The Great Stagnation, and the subtitle is How America Ate All the Low-Hanging Fruit of Modern History, Got Sick, and Will Eventually Feel Better. So my outline today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the Great Stagnation and what Tyler means by that. I'm going to talk about the White House Brain Activity Map project. I'm going to talk about a notion that a number of us in Washington have put together called the Cognitive Society that I think weaves together the various federal investments and areas that we believe need federal investment in a way that makes sense and echoes Rob Leland's talk. I'll talk about some concrete goals for the next decade, some infrastructure needs that imply investments, a new approach towards R&D strategies, and then I'll end with some conclusions and priorities. So let's start out with the Great Stagnation. By the way, Tyler has a regular column for the New York Times, but he also has one of the most popular economic blogs out there in the net. It's called Marginal Revolution, and he has one of the largest massively online economics courses on development economics. He's really a thought leader in this area. So what does Tyler mean by stagnation, and why am I worried? Apart from the fact that I read the book and it was compelling. So you're looking on this graph at real median household income over the period of at least my childhood through adulthood. And the take-home message here is that there was some growth during the 60s and 70s, but then things have leveled off. And just to give you a comparison, a historical comparison, this is the same figure lengthened the x-axis for the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that something very, very disturbing has happened just in the last 10 to 20 years in terms of how well people are doing in our economy. So since I'm out here in the West, I thought I'd start with this figure and you'd begin to see what the stagnation is about. So obviously we all recognize what this is, and we recognize what this is, and the argument is that what this is and what this is not really so different. Actually, these two things roughly go at the same speed. They operate according to the same principles. Every single one of you, well, most of you, could drive this because you can drive this. Probably none of us could drive this. Well, actually, I definitely can. But the argument is, in the case of ground transportation, that things have sort of leveled off. Let's look at more detail in the regular household. So this is a modernistic-looking kitchen from about 1959. Culled from a lifestyle magazine, and I think we can all recognize the basic parts of this kitchen. Makes sense. Looks pretty luxurious to me. Almost looks like lab benches there. But this was the notion of what a kitchen should look like in the late 1950s, and here's the modern version of that, and it basically has the same things on it. It just is. It's a little bit different in terms of look and feel, but things haven't changed that much. And so in spite of this notion that we are moving technologically at the speed of light, in practicality, in the way people are actually living their lives, the differences that happened during the period of time from our great-grandparents to our grandparents to what we've been living through in this generation and the generations that end with the millennials is it's been a slowed down technological evolution in spite of our feeling to the contrary. Let's look at some more thoughts along these lines. So Moore's Law. Actually, I took this picture for an NSF book. The bottom chip is a $20,000 imaging board that I used in my thesis work in the 1980s at the University of Michigan. And on top of it is my iPhone 4, which is already obsolete. But metaphorically, this is what gives us the feeling that we're moving at light speed. And yet, in terms of practicalities of people's lives, let's look at jobs versus market value of some companies that we all know. So the three companies that I'm looking at are Ford, Google, and Facebook. And in blue, you're seeing the number of employees that those companies have. And in red, you're seeing their market value. So a couple of things to take home. I guess the big take-home message is that in spite of this technology on steroids and Moore's law, somehow it's not resulting in more jobs in our economy. All right? Facebook, for all its enormous market capitalization, actually has relatively few employees. And the same is true for Google relative to a company, a legacy company like Ford. And I'm not saying Ford is legacy in terms of technology, but it's been around a long time. And the employment that you see right here actually, while being enormous compared to Google and Facebook, actually has fallen off by as much as 80% since Ford was at its high in mid-20th century. So this technology from Moore's law isn't translating into day-to-day lives in the folks who make up the American economy. And that is representing a real stressor for stability going forward in this country. All right? The promise of the American dream revolves around the fact that there is an opportunity for people to economically better themselves over time, and that requires hard work, it requires a job, and we're not seeing that for some reason. Additionally, the notions that I certainly had as a teenager growing up of flying cars, the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, none of that actually has come to pass, all right? I can tell you as a teenager, I was absolutely certain that in the movie 2001, which had a space station and a Pan Am looking space shuttle that went to it in an exploratory mission to Jupiter, my thought at that time, and I shared that with many folks growing up in the Caltech community of the 1970s, is that was underestimating where we would be, not overestimating where we would be. So, the Great Stagnation argument is that Moore's law is not like the Industrial Revolution or the advent of electrification in this country. Moore's law is something different. And in a sense, Moore's law has certainly offered the opportunity for us to enjoy leisure in more creative ways. Think about it. Yesterday on the plane flight out, I loaded a couple of movies onto my iPad to watch on the plane on the way out. And the notion of doing something like that, even 20, 30 years ago, would have been ludicrous. But fundamentally, that while there is an ability for folks to have, let's say, more creative leisure time, to reach out through social networks to one another and form, let's say, different forms of social interactions, that fundamentally, qualitatively, is different from what happened across our country with the Industrial Revolution and electrification that happened early in the 20th century. And the thesis of the Great Stagnation is that it's that qualitative difference which has led to the flattening out of how well we're doing as families across the country. So, I'm going to switch gears now and talk about something that broke in the news exactly a week ago. Here's a New York Times story that broke, and Financial Times jumped on it immediately afterwards. And here's an op-ed by David Eagleman over the past weekend in the New York Times about the White House Brain Activity Map initiative. And let's think about that initiative. The first reason to think about it is that when the White House comes out with a large-scale science announcement, that's usually pretty rare. Generally, big science initiatives come out of the science agencies in this country. The other aspect is that if we're thinking about neuroscience in this way, and it's coming out of the White House, and we're seeing really big numbers attached to the investment, It's inevitable that we think back in our own history to things like the Apollo Moonshot program, the Human Genome Project, polar science with the South Pole Station and some of the big telescopes, thinking possibly that neuroscience is suddenly transforming itself through the leadership of the White House from the single PI enterprise that it's been for years and years and years into a big science type program. That's really important for all of us to think about at this conference, to think about, because if we are going to get to an end point of developing essentially a successor to Moore's Law to perform high performance computation, that is not an initiative that can be driven by small scale science investments of the type that most academics like myself are familiar with. It's going to have to happen because of a transformation in federal investments in neuroscience from this small scale, let a million flowers bloom, into major strategic investment. So that's an important sign. On the other hand, in spite of what I read in the New York Times, it's okay. I'll talk through that, and I don't have the internet available, so I'll just talk through that. The brain activity map notion is incredibly daunting, and that's because of the actual complexity of neural systems. You see what I say there. Even for those of us who are professionally neuroscientists, we tend to get hung up by the circuit diagrams that we live our lives by, and by a technique that came out of the 19th century called Golgi staining, where we actually are able to stain 1 out of every 10,000 neurons as opposed to all of the neurons. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you the movie that I wanted to show you here. It comes from Steve Smith's lab at Stanford. It uses a technique called axial array tomography to actually visualize every single synapse in a chunk of mouse neocortex. The take-home is this, that when you see this movie, and I urge all of you, if you get a chance, if you haven't seen it before, to actually get on YouTube and Google this, when you actually visualize the complexity of the mouse neocortex, which is less complex, obviously, than our own, at its full resolution, it's mind-blowing. And the notion of looking at the activity of all those interlocking computational elements is extraordinary, right? We are not talking about a simple problem here. So the first issue with the Brain Activity Map project is that we should be very careful not to underestimate its complexity. Let's think about human brains versus digital computers for a moment. That theme has already come up today, and I believe it's likely to come up many more times today. I have some provocative comments to make, and they're on the right side. Many of you know that Dharmendra Mota out at IBM's Almaden is working on a high-performance computational approach to neurobiology, IBM True North. I talked to Dharmendra this past week. He's talking about 10 to the 14th synapses, running about 10 to the 3rd the speed of the human brain. That's really extraordinary. The project which I compare Dharmendra's to in Europe is the one led by Henry Markham, recently funded by the European Union. The ticket value of 1 billion euros. Each of these projects aims for a, rather than an applications approach, which is what I think this meeting is about, aims at a computational neuroscience approach at simulating brains at a high fidelity scale inside computers in order to create a virtuous cycle between models and experimentation. By the way, this is absolutely critical. In our wet lab experimentation in neuroscience these days, we've come to the limit of actually putting together the data stream that's coming in from our laboratories and other laboratories to the point where we can generate hypotheses that are parsimonious with the data that's out there. All right? So these models at IBM and in Switzerland of Henry Markham, they are not aimed at being neurally inspired computing, though they touch on computing and they are certainly neurally inspired. Rather, they are aimed at automatic hypothesis generation for the conducting of proper neuroscience experiments in the future, that is, actual wet lab experiments, in a way that makes sense of this this fire hose that's coming in from the field. All right? So let's back up a little and let's look at the left-hand side of the column. Most of you know this, that we have 10 to the 11th neurons in our brain, but there are about 10 to the 4th synapses on each of them. So we really have about 10 to the 15th computational elements in our brains. Really extraordinary. The more we learn about synapses, the more we realize how incredibly complex an individual synapse is. It has an ability to reconfigure itself dynamically over a period of from seconds to minutes. It also has a very interesting constraint system built into it, in that a synapse only exists where a presynaptic axon approaches a postsynaptic dendrite with a threshold of several microns. All right, that actually creates a fascinating constraint system in how you wire up a brain. Human brains are incredibly parallel. They use a relatively low amount of power. I think 20 watts is what I've heard. They're wetware, so nominally they're slow. That is, the components are slow. But most importantly, if we look at the Boolean, does the hardware equal the software? That's true for brains. And of course, to date, that's not true for digital computers. There's another aspect which I think is really important, and it gets to message passing in human brains versus digital computers. The more we look at biological brains, the more we come up hard against this concept of molecular signal transduction. And basically, molecular signal transduction is the way that the cell biology has for multiple inputs communicating with multiple outputs in a way that's extraordinarily elegant, and actually not only uses very little power, but also gets around bottlenecks that creep up in parallel computing systems that really can bite us. All right? So when we think about message passing as being a non-trivial problem in digital computers, brains largely finesse that through molecular signal transduction. And the more we learn about signal transduction, it has the ability of both of maintaining separateness of band connections between nodes, but it also has the ability for crosstalk. And both of these coexist at the same time in a very nice way. This is Dharmendra's approach at IBM at the atomic level going forward. So think of this as CMOS, but CMOS adapted to operate in a sort of analog way where the transistors are approximating neurons rather than their usual digital form. I think this is a potentially very valid approach. And another aspect that I think is very powerful about it is that it doesn't attempt, and this is in contrast to the European approach of trying to actually recapitulate every fine detail of the mammalian neocortical system. It doesn't attempt to do that. Rather, it attempts to pull out the most important salient aspects for how actual brains compute and then rebuild them in CMOS. And of course, the goal for the folks at IBM is that eventually the speed aspects of CMOS relative to that of actual biological neurons will become advantageous. Of course, the power constraint is enormous, and right now, neither they nor the rest of us see a way forward in that aspect. So I think that could be a very valid contribution for the folks here at Sandia to make a serious contribution to. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at our own place. If you think about the diversity of neurons in the brain, it really can be quite scary. To reconstruct three-dimensionally a single neuron is measured in the field in graduate student years today. And when Allen Brain Institute, us, and Genelia Farms actually attempted to put out a grand challenge prize to move beyond the graduate student to the computer, we were only partially successful. And to this day, reconstructing neurons remains a very human-intensive task. So it becomes incumbent upon all of us, therefore, to share that data. At my own institute, we curate the international resource for that data called neuromorpho.org, which you are welcome to look at. And it allows one to not only call up any of the three-dimensional reconstructions that have been done by any laboratory in the world, but it allows one to actually select various aspects of the morphometrics involved in those neurons, or to insert artificial biophysical systems into those neurons, or artificial signal transduction systems into those neurons to look at the relationship between form and function. All right? So there are a couple of important aspects here to neuromorpho.org. The first, of course, is the sheer scale of it. So these are all the neurons that have been submitted to neuromorpho.org. This is about 2 years old. It's tripled now, but that's still an awful lot of neurons. Keep thinking in terms of graduate student years. And in actuality, each of these neurons is not a two-dimensional projection, but represents a full three-dimensional reconstruction of each of these neurons. Now, while there are 10 to the 11th neurons in your brain, there's probably a much smaller number of neuron types in your brain. For those of us who are neuroscientists, there are several neuron types that we can recognize with the same ease that a lot of people represent oak trees or tulip poplar trees. Tulip poplar is the most common tree in the Washington, D.C. area because of their shape. The cortical pyramidal cell is easily recognizable. The cerebellar Purkinje cell is easily recognizable. So, yes, there are 10 to the 11th neurons in your brain, but there are probably only on the order of 10 to the 3rd to 10 to the 4th types of neurons in your brain. And that's an extraordinarily important simplification to be used in understanding how the brain can be hooked together. Now, getting back to this notion of the brain activity map, projects like we are doing with neuromorpho.org are one piece of it, and probably tied to the piece that most of you know of as the connectome. By the way, we actually have had several of these neuronal reconstructions commissioned as a full-size sculpture. This neuron's title is Mental Floss. It's traveled from our institute to Genelia Farms, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and will shortly be shown at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington. It's a great teaching tool. That neuron that you're looking in copper actually represents a real neuron that existed at one time in a real mouse that had dreams of a higher education. And here you can actually see the folks at our institute enjoying the teaching aspects of this reconstruction. But if we want to jump back and think about what the brain activity map really means, unfortunately we come to this matrix, which has the list of neurons in the brain. There are 10 to the 11th of those, and their time maps, their time evolutions in millisecond time bends. All right? And the deliverable of the brain activity map is this matrix. All right? And the promise, which I'll just leave out there hanging for you, is that somehow this matrix will allow us to get beyond the great stagnation that I described at the beginning of my talk and get to something better. By the way, this matrix leaves out some things that are critically important. But even leaving out morphological plasticity, the fact that your dentate gyrus in your hippocampus births 20,000 new nerve cells every single day of your adult life, and the fact that we probably should think about organizing this matrix by something that Donald Hebb called the cell assembly, that is, the neurons that play together in a string quartet underlying a concept or a thought. Even if we leave those out, just generating this matrix at the proper resolution being by neuron and by millisecond time band, that is action potential, is really a tough nut to crack. So I head down this direction. I'm going to put out the notion of a change that we need going forward, a change to becoming a cognitive society. We need a new brain-inspired industrial revolution. So, what is our vision for a cognitive society? First of all, and I'll come back to this later, this notion of globally enhanced cognitive awareness. This is already happening at some level because we're using this thing called a smartphone to connect ourselves with one another. And this is not only true in rich countries like the United States and Western Europe, but this is even more importantly true in developing countries, particularly developing countries undergoing very rapid political changes. Second, we believe that a cognitive society will be an emergent, in the Santa Fe Institute sense of that word, of a set of trajectories in multiple fields. That includes neuroscience, but also includes computer science, includes cognitive psychology, includes behavioral biology, includes molecular biology. That's all going on together. And our argument is that the cognitive society will come out of that, thinking of those revolutions as complex adaptive systems. You know, if you think about the game of chess, what gives chess its richness is its rule set. All right? It's not integrally, carefully categorizing the shapes of the pieces or the simplicity of the board. It's the rule set for chess that generates a game that's captured the imagination of folks around the world for a very long period of time. The accelerator that gets us beyond the brain activity map, gets us beyond connectome, gets us into a real decade of the mind is cognome. And for us, cognome is a rule set for how brains create thought, how brains create learning, memory, higher cognition. The hope is that in a future cognitive society, we'll have a renaissance in human cognition and social communication. And in the practical world of science, we hope that that will enhance something that is very important to all of us in this room, team science. What's happened in the last decade? Well, I use a term called Neuro-X. We're actually running a symposium on Neuro-X in Washington, D.C. in May. You could look up Neuro-X on the web at neurox.gmu.edu. All these fields have added neuro to their titles. And supposedly, it's a recognition of the fact that human brains are involved in the making of economic decisions, in the making of ethical decisions, in deciding whether Coke or Pepsi is better, deciding what deception detection actually is and what kind of deception we care about. So, in the last decade, neuroscience has populated other social science fields in a way that's really unprecedented for any hard science field. Computing has changed in the last decade in the ways that we're all familiar with, and that's gone parallel with the massive investments and improvements in functional brain imaging, and with functional brain imaging, the ability to stimulate brains, that is manipulate brains, and reach out and touch neurons in order to control brain circuits and then observe those brain circuits in real living human beings as they react to being touched. All right? When I say the social enabling of big data, it's a realization that somehow, de facto, most of us have given permission for big data to reach out and touch our lives. So I do know a few people in Washington who care very much about the privacy issue, but I look at the vast majority of folks across the waterfront who've essentially given companies like Facebook and Google permission to access their information in a massive way. That social enabling of big data is a very recent phenomenon and is, I think, quite important. Finally, something very intriguing is happening in America. It's also happening across the world. I refer to it as general access to maker technology, referring to the maker movement. This is basically the deployment of what we used to call high technology into the general populace, right? I recently purchased for myself a $35 board called the Raspberry Pi, which is being used ubiquitously in computer science courses across Europe, particularly the United Kingdom. It represents for $35 what would have been state of the art about the turn of the century, about 2000. It's an example of technology flowing from where it used to be exclusively in laboratories like Sandia or my own institute to being a general aspect of the population at large. And where this ends up, we don't know, but we hope it ends up in facilitating a move towards this cognitive society that I was talking about. This is the picture that you're all familiar with from the media. The media at some point in the 1990s became enamored with these pictures. As you know, the resolution of these pictures, functional brain imaging, is not actually properly matched to the real neural code, either in time resolution or space resolution. It's actually off by about 1,000 in each. We're beginning to see aspects of where we might go technologically going forward to get a proper matchup. This is work from Phil Keller's lab at Genelia Farm. You're looking on the left panel at a Drosophila embryo where we're looking not at a selection of cells, we're looking at every single cell in that embryo, and we can follow at half-second resolution the trajectory of every single one of those cells. That means the universe of cells in that Drosophila over time as it wires up and develops. So in this particular example, albeit a simple animal model, we're capturing the dynamics properly and the cellular resolution properly to actually begin to understand the complexity of this process. This is another movie that if you get to check it out on YouTube is well worth your time. The wiring up of a Drosophila embryo is one of the most amazingly beautiful things to watch as it happens in real time. Point is this: we need every cell, and we need to follow what every cell is doing in real time. This is one approach that is being deployed to get around some of the limitations of fMRI imaging. This is MEG imaging, where we give up some spatial resolution to gain a tremendous amount of temporal resolution. As you can see, the spatial resolution is not so hot. On the other hand, we begin to operate at the temporal resolutions that are required to understand actual neural dynamics, all right? So when you think back to the brain activity map matrix that I was talking about, we've blurred the y-axis on that matrix, but we're operating properly on the x-axis part of that matrix. So what did I mean in terms of cognitive society between global cognitive awareness? So you're looking at cartoons here. None of this really happens, all right? On the other hand, what we really do have now is a technique called hyperscanning, where we actually put college students in fMRI scanners that are hooked up on the internet to one another and can actually talk to one another. So the scanners can talk to one another, and the people can interact with one another, all right? In hyperscanning, the question of human decision-making, particularly highly consequential decision-making, becomes a testable problem, becomes scientific, because we can test hypotheses, all right? So it's not too difficult to see that as we approach some of the new technologies that come beyond fMRI, what we're seeing nascent in hyperscanning may actually allow us to get at some more intriguing aspects of what happens when human beings are cognitively aware of one another, interact large scale to create things like markets, wars, mass migration, what have you. Additionally, the sensory modalities that we have can be reprogrammed. One of the ones that intrigues me most is the gustatory modality, which in the DoD context, think DARPA, has been re-engineered to provide a danger signal for operators as they're operating in hostile environments, and a drone needs to let them know what's around the next corner in a way that doesn't take up bandwidth of other channels. So think you suddenly taste sour in your mouth, and you think twice about going around that corner because the drone is actually letting you know that there's something really bad around that corner. Germane to all of us is the idea that there will be a cognitive science of science. This is all geared towards scientific teams. For too long, scientists, particularly scientists in fields like my own, in the life sciences, have operated as loners. And that's put us at a tremendous disadvantage to actually sort of trying to move paradigmatically ahead. All right? So how are we going to help science teams move ahead? All right? So NSF's IGERT programs are an example of trying to train future scientists to have multiple skills, multiple mentors, multiple skills, so that they are not sitting alone in their silos. Goals for the next decade. So, succinctly, we believe that it's time and productively to use robotic tech that's cognitively enabled as support structures for human beings. All right, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We believe that there's an opportunity to learn something about the cognome, the rule set for the human brain, to actually begin to make a difference in public health. Another of the maker revolutions that is ongoing is personalized access to omics, particularly genomics. The company 23andMe, founded by Sergey Brin's spouse, Google. You see an ad for that there. But the ability to have access to your own molecular biological information is happening quite rapidly, and is certainly going to play a role in how people make decisions about their own health. Most importantly, our goal for the next decade is a notion of national reinvention, and goal of getting us out of this great stagnation. So this is from the Centis Lab at UT Austin, but Brian Scazzolati at Yale is actually one of the leaders in this area. Most of us know what a Roomba robot is. That's the vacuum cleaning robot that maybe isn't so effective, but is a lot of fun to actually watch or put up tricks to try and mess with its head. Actually, it doesn't have a head, but you get the idea. But actually, the promise of robotics to actually enhance senior life and keep us productive through a larger component of our senior life is absolutely critically important. In fact, if you think about the economic challenges facing our country, particularly in terms of healthcare, the ability to have the hope to keep us productive for a longer component of our life is really an amazing promise. This is the work of Sheila Nierenberg in New York. The notion is to use optogenetics. That's the using photonic control of molecular biologically engineered ion channels to essentially artificially control the nervous system. The notion in the Nuremberg retina is using photonic stimulation to guide optogenetic control of ganglion cells in the retina to create a cortical image where it would normally not be a cortical image in a blind person. All right. While this may be close to fruition in rodent models, obviously our advances in gene therapy, particularly with regard to ethical, legal, and social issues, aren't quite there yet. This is the lowest cost sequencer that I know of out there. Most of us could afford one of these fairly easily. This is like what a stereo component used to cost when I was back in college. And it can do whole genome sequencing. This medical student at UT Austin just won one in a prize. So presumably he's not only going to practice medicine in the hospital, but he's perhaps going to learn a little bit about his own genome on the side. So it's time to lead again comes from a commercial, I think, for one of the big oil companies over the last decade. But it's not a bad way to think about what national reinvention would be about. Our country was really a leader in technology for a long time during the 20th century. And this lab played an absolutely central, critical part of that. And the worry is that we're losing that. So here the ideas are enhancing the range of our productive years, increasing levels of safety and security, all right? Here I'm talking in the public health context, but you guys operate in the national security context, and they're both critically important. This line about Moore's Law, we're really all about moving beyond Moore's Law. But if you think about the trouble with what the quants did on Wall Street in 2008, the problem was that high-performance computing and algorithms wasn't enough to save the folks on Wall Street from the fact that they were dealing with, the quants on Wall Street, that they were dealing with a complex adaptive system where collateralized debt instruments got away from them, especially the credit default swap wraps on those instruments. We have to learn to be able to model complex adaptive systems in a way that gives us insight into them and recognizes their complexity. And then this last bullet comes from the last year traveling around the world from Europe through Asia, South America, and back to the States. It's a common factor across many, many societies that share interests with us. That is, not only is it important to extend lifespan biologically, but that's only worthwhile if you keep life meaningful through those years, all right? Life has to be kept meaningful as you're aging. And for that to happen, what's up here has to keep functioning at some level. Think Alzheimer's disease. So concretely, what do we think we need? First of all, we need to prime our American pipeline with the right kind of folks. I use the word transdisciplinary scientists. There's a lot of debate in the policy arena about what constitutes a transdisciplinary scientist, but you sort of get the idea. Someone who reaches out professionally as a scientist or an engineer beyond one domain. They don't operate in a silo. And going with that, the notion that our big science advances are going to come from team science approaches, like you practice here at Sandia. We're going to need to develop the tools to understand the cognome. Big data is part of that. The brain activity map is part of that, all right? And our ability to interact with ensembles of neurons, think of cell assemblies, to turn them on and off in new and creative ways. Going on along with that are the proper governance structures. I spent most of my time in Europe over the last year going over governance structures for the future of big neuroscience because the Europeans are most concerned about those governance structures. As you know, they care a great deal more about genetically modified food than we do here. They look at what they're doing and what we're doing in terms of neurally inspired computing, and they're going, what are the governance structures going to be? And those are valid questions. R&D strategies. So the first one I mentioned already. The second one is mind the gap. So in the arena of life sciences, brain sciences, there is a gap between NIH and NSF funding coverage. It's generally the area that this conference is about. You're in the gap, all right? You're in the gap where NIH, with its focus on curing diseases, feels a little uncomfortable, and the NSF, with its focus on basic science, feels a little iffy, all right? So Sandia can be a key component of minding that gap, but that has to be filled or we're going to be at a tremendous disadvantage. The P&T in the next bullet is promotion and tenure, which is a central part of American academia. Currently, it doesn't incentivize the type of science that I'm talking about. I run an institute where I am luckily able to protect scientists who reach across intellectual boundaries, but that's not usually the case. And we need more places in the U.S. where young people who are interested in crossing those disciplinary boundaries can be supported. I'll finish up. Human society faces some massive cognitive, communicative, and physical challenges ahead. Global climate change and our reaction to it is one of them. And the quality of human decision-making is really a function of our brains and the emergent effects of how our brains interact with one another. All right? When you look at the global financial crisis of 2008, realize that even though we don't understand in detail how it happened, we do know that human brains produced it. Recognize that the welfare of humans feeds back onto human cognitive capabilities. If you're hungry and starving, you don't think very well, all right? So there's a feedback loop between how well people are doing, think the Great Stagnation, and their thought processes, and therefore their decision-making abilities. So convergent technologies that affect human cognition, communication, and quality of life are extraordinarily important. I believe that those lie at the basis of a cognitive society. In that cognitive society, clearly the brain-machine interface will be increasingly blurred. I hope humans will be increasingly deeply connected to one another. And I expect that the notion of self will evolve in yet unpredictable ways. I'll end there, and I thank you very much for your attention. Are there questions?
The Mesa tour that we're going to have. We have a sign up at the front desk, at the registration desk, so if you're interested, please go ahead and sign up. We were limited to 25 people, and the spots are filling up fairly quickly, so and that's going to be on Wednesday afternoon, 2 to 3 p.m. Again, if you're looking for the Wi-Fi password for this conference room, it's Marriott 13 in lowercase, and the link is Advantage AV. So with some of the, I guess, housekeeping announcements done, I'd like to go ahead and get started. What I'm going to try to do is just give you a broad overview and try to step back actually a couple steps from this workshop, kind of try to give you the big picture view and try to bring it back tied to the workshop and see where we might be headed. Again, my name's Murad Okandan. I'm one of the researchers at Sandia National Labs, and I'm delighted and very excited that you were all able to attend this workshop. There are some really exciting things potentially coming down the road, and hopefully we'll be able to initiate some of those activities and pursue some of those interesting things together, hopefully. So very similar to the earlier talks today, I'll give a brief overview looking at the problem, and I'll try to present this from several different points of view, but the first one is, again, this one, conventional computers, Moore's law is saturating, actually has saturated. And even beyond that, there are certain cases of problems where conventional computers are not the best tools for addressing those problems. And what's our challenge? Actually, our challenge is then figuring out what's next, what's coming down the road, and also trying to find out what impact does this have on our, let's say, mission space, market share, or research portfolio, depending on which sphere we live in. Now, thinking about critical impact of a technology like this, what might come next? Here are a few of them. Looking at game-changing technologies in the national security space, there are very important implications of that just by itself. Being able to know what a technology can do or cannot do is very important in certain cases. Actually, building on what Jim was talking about earlier, the industrial paradigm shift. If you look at microelectronics right now, it's a $300 billion a year industry with trillions riding on top of it. And what if that technology saturates? What happens when it changes? What might be next? And again, kind of the next critical impact point, looking at the game theory of the mind, how individuals interact, how societies interact. Having tools that give us further insight into that direction would also be really important to consider. So what might be coming down the road? Is it a paradigm shift? And hopefully we'll be able to think about that a little bit at this workshop and have some answers by the end. So now to tell this in the form of a story, here is the beginning of the story. And depending on your interpretation, in the beginning there was nothing, or maybe it was the end. So that's actually an astrophysics conference we're going to hold next week, but in any case. This isn't showing up all that nicely. Actually, could you go ahead and turn off the light? Yeah, that's better. Talking about the big picture, that actually is the biggest picture we have, 14 billion years later after the beginning. That's the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, where every pixel is a galaxy with 100 billion stars in it. And give or take about 13 to 14 billion years across, and we're kind of in the middle of it right there. And to the best of our knowledge, only two things drive this picture. First is energy, and actually in a very physical sense, just energy, and information. Now, we're a part of this picture, so what drives us, our civilization, is exactly the same thing. Energy is survival. We capture energy, store energy, and use that energy to go capture even more energy. And information is actually how we learn to do that better, and that allows us to have progress in our civilization. It's our ability to tell stories that actually is at the core of this, that we can understand things, make a framework of what we've learned so far, and then transfer it to another individual or to our offspring. And now what we're talking about at this workshop is potentially a tool that gives us incredible capabilities in this information category, in our ability to understand things and make new discoveries. And if you think about what has been that very powerful tool so far, it's been microelectronics. We have been able to capture, store, and analyze data at unprecedented scales, and that actually has impacted our society. If you actually think back to the last decade, how communications and access to communication, rapid communication, has changed things, that definitely has been the case. Now, thinking about what that paradigm shift might be, there's a really interesting analogy to transportation, and I'll go ahead and share that with you. If you look at this is the first steam locomotive ever. Now that's getting a little bit bigger and a little bit faster. That's the biggest steam locomotive ever built, and that's actually the strongest locomotive out there, 10,000 horsepower and maybe a little bit more. But they all do the same thing, and they're all limited by the same thing as well. The limitation is the amount of weight you can put per axle before you start damaging the tracks. And the thing they do is take something from point A to point B, just more and more of it and faster and faster. What came as a paradigm shift was this, and it's not showing as nicely, but space capsule. Now, again, this is taking something from point A to point B, but now you're going through the air, and it's allowing you to do things very differently. And in the other case, now point B is in orbit. These things then allow you to view the problems in very different perspectives. Now, looking at computation, from the very first machines, the Babbage's difference engine, other mechanical computers, that's John von Neumann with Maniac Zero, the first programmable digital computer, and our current supercomputers, and even the exascale computer that we're working on right now. They all do the same thing, just more and more of it, and faster, and they're all limited by the same thing, the amount of power you can put into individual computation elements before they start making errors. So what might be the paradigm shift for computation or information processing? And what I think we'll have a chance to talk about at this workshop is that paradigm shift might come in the form of how we do information processing, actually doing it very differently. And that also brings with it the added bonus and also the complication, how we view the problems. In terms of how we've actually looked at the universe around us, we've gotten really good at parsing things into certain ways and then throwing them onto our computers to get some answers. If we have a new tool that allows us to view those problems in a completely different way, that actually might be really interesting as well. There's a really interesting historical note here. Von Neumann, Stanislav Ulam, and Turing, in mid-40s, mid-50s, they had already started thinking about this. They very rightfully so thought 10,000 switches was going to be the limit for any realizable computational machine, and had started thinking about sort of stochastic probabilistic codes for doing computation. It's just that microelectronics came along and blew that 10,000 number out of the water by 9 orders of magnitude, but now we're at a point where that is also saturating. So now, thinking about neural computation as an inspiration for what might be next, there's also a really important point to be made. What this system can do and cannot do, or maybe shouldn't do. In terms of conventional systems, the way the stored program architecture has worked, it's incredibly good at doing precise calculations and keeping exact values for those calculations. So what we're hoping to build next is not going to replace that, but hopefully leverage that. And there are other approaches, such as quantum information processing, others that might have certain strengths in certain areas. But what we're really hoping is that it's going to be something that's a hybrid approach that's going to be the most powerful solution to some of our problems. So now getting a little bit deeper into neural computation, it's not a von Neumann architecture system. Again, hopefully this is provocative, so there will be more discussion later on. Not right now, hopefully. What it does is pattern recognition, abstraction, and prediction, and adjustment, basically learning. It's dynamic and it's multidimensional. Again, things happen in sort of second scale up to minutes to hours, even years, in terms of looking at how a neural system adapts. And what I've been calling this is it's a difference engine and accumulator with goals. And the goals are very biologically based. It's acquire sustenance, avoid predators, and reproduce. A key question that's coming up in this direction is, how is data represented, processed, stored, and recalled? This is still an open question. We have answers in different parts of the brain, different parts of neuroscience, but it's still not a complete answer. But we are able to then collect some of these into hopefully inform what we're going to be able to do next. That little asterisk at the end, thinking about the existence proof we have in terms of neural computation, our neocortex, it's an existence proof, but it's not necessarily the optimum solution. We might be able to come up with systems that can potentially do much, much better than that without having to do all the things that a biological substrate has to do. That's very exciting and potentially challenging as well. Now, looking at this from, again, the other perspective, looking at from Moore's law limitations, there are two things from the physics side and one application side that's driving this. If you look at device scaling beyond 7 nanometers or even 5 nanometers, if those devices can be made and actually made at an economical way, economically feasible way, again, we might be able to push the technology a little bit further, get a little bit more out, but most recently some of the challenges with yielding low technology node processes and not being able to get them as cost effective as before, there are some challenges that are creeping up from this direction also. That might be surmountable. This other point is actually not surmountable. It's insurmountable. The power density, power consumption per operation, even if you take the lowest numbers possible per unit operation done in an electronic machine and scale it up to exascale, you are in need of hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts of continuous power, which again is tractable in certain cases. You might be able to do this in 2 or 3 locations for certain applications, but at this point it's not a general purpose machine anymore. And looking at it from the application side, as we mentioned before, the most challenging problems involve these large, noisy, incomplete, what you might call natural data sets. And the von Neumann architecture, they can only do exact and algorithmic calculations and nothing else. There's really no native path for doing abstraction in the system as it is. So, trying to keep my presentation as brief as possible, I'm going to have another presentation later on where we're talking about details of the technology, at least one example of what we might be able to do. I'd like to jump way ahead. Let's say we built something like this. What are we going to do with it? Many answers, but here's one answer. Feynman's answer. It's again, I mean, case in point, GPUs, general purpose GPUs or whatever, but they're driven by a gaming industry. Again, that commoditization in terms of when things are available at a very large scale, then people find lots and lots of different things to do with them. And whatever we think we're going to do with these systems we're hoping to build, there are probably lots of things that we haven't thought about. So coming specifically to our workshop, there are three general areas. Neuroscience, devices and systems, and applications. We'll have presentations in all those three areas. And our three goals are actually identifying and maybe detailing some of those applications, highlighting some of the technologies and approaches that are going to provide some of the answers, and then actually teaming in terms of finding the right groups of people to work on this, and then pursuing some of the opportunities that might be coming up. And our long-term goals for this new emerging field, hopefully, first is the creation of a powerful tool for doing information processing in a completely new way, and that this has many, many further developments coming after that. And the second one is understanding neurocomputation and cognition. The systems we build for doing information processing, we might be able to feed them back into neuroscience to gain some of the insight that we're not able to gain with our current systems. So some of the potential applications, I'll go through these fairly briefly, and then I'll highlight them more in the follow-on talk. Again, native probabilistic computation for robotics, communication systems, unhackable, non-reverse engineerable systems, looking at very large data sets and data streams, doing fraud prevention and anomaly detection without needing megawatt power levels, and modeling of very large complex probabilistic systems. For example, looking at physics data, the data sets that are coming out of CERN, for example, or looking at how people interact, anthropology, economics, markets, and even history. So if there are any sci-fi fans, Asimov fans out there, it's psychohistory. Anyone? Psychohistory? Yep. A couple. Actually, quite a few. That's good. Again, one thing, that last point about uncovering patterns not readily observable, this is actually how we do science. We think about a certain physical system, we build tools, measurement instruments to go make measurements, and build a framework of how that system might work, ask some more questions, and then go make more measurements, and then try to refine that problem further and further. Tools like we are talking about here might enable us to do that in a scale that we haven't really dreamed of before. And tying this back into the biological systems, actually, neural prosthesis, the retinal implant actually was approved by the FDA, I believe about 2 weeks ago. The cochlear implant has been around for quite some time, and actually being able to decode how the neural systems encode information, and then being able to provide a close linkage between microelectronic and biological systems is really, really interesting. And in terms of prosthesis, that's restoring lost function, but really doesn't have to stop there, and probably won't stop there. Augmentation in terms of being able to give other capabilities that we currently don't have would be really interesting to look at. So now, at least the end of this story, we're back at the beginning, or at the end, so depending on your view. And I believe there are some really exciting things that we might be able to pursue here, and we also need to be very cautious about some of the things that might come up. And I'll get back to that in a second, but to complete the story, I must give you one more thing. Like any good story, you need to have three things. I gave you energy and information, and the third thing is you, actually us, in terms of how we decide, what we decide to do here, and where we go from this point on. We'll have probably very large impact. And the part about the caution, actually, the technologies that we might be able to develop here are potentially very, very powerful, and they could get very close to the core of who we are, what we value, and how we make decisions, and what makes us human, and maybe even where we might be heading. So again, that's probably taking the vision very far further into the future, but those are the kinds of things that we might be able to do. And I think we'll take some of the very early steps at this workshop, hopefully together, and then and be able to pursue them with even greater resources available. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker. Actually, are there any questions or comments while we're doing the switchover?